Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to continue our discussion on fluid and electrolyte balance, and we're going to start the discussion by talking about sodium regulation in the body. We'll then move on to discuss the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, which is an important player in regulating blood pressure. The first question is, what would happen if our kidney couldn't get rid of sodium? If we look at a normal sodium level in the body, it's approximately 140 milliosmoles per liter. It makes up about that amount. 2 teaspoons of salt contain 155 milliosmoles. And we're talking about sodium chloride here. If we were to try to bring our osmolarity down to normal by just drinking water after ingesting just 2 teaspoons of salt, if you work out the math, 140 milliosmoles per liter, if 2 teaspoons of salt contain 155 milliosmoles in a certain amount of liters, what would the volume have to be in order to bring you back to 140 milliosmoles? Well, the answer to that is it would be approximately 1.1 liters. And so for every liter of water, you'd have to drink an extra 100 milliliters of water to return your osmolarity of the extracellular fluid back to normal. So if you think about how many liters of water you have in your body, there's about 42 liters. And in order to bring that back down to normal, you'd have to drink 4.2 liters of water just after ingesting 2 teaspoons of sodium chloride. And without that water, it would actually bring up our osmolarity. And we can work out how much it would bring up our osmolarity by. All we have to do is take the total fluid volume, and we would take the amount of milliosmoles that are added by 2 teaspoons of salt, and that is actually 155 milliosmoles of sodium plus 155 milliosmoles of chloride ions. So when it's dissolved in water, the salt dissociates in it, and you get 155 milliosmoles of each ion. So if you look at how much that will contribute to the overall osmolarity per liter, it works out to about 7.4 milliosmoles per liter, which is a significant increase. And that will cause there to be issues by you would start drawing water from your cells. Your cells would shrink, the function would be disrupted, and a lot of important processes for life would cease. So there has to be a way to regulate sodium in the body. And this is our main homeostatic response to salt. If we ingest sodium chloride with no change in the volume at all, there would be a change in osmolarity. And this would cause 2 things to happen. Number one, you would have the thirst receptors stimulated. You have thirst receptors in your hypothalamus. And so it would recognize a higher osmolarity. Your thirst receptors would be stimulated, and it would tell you need to drink water. The second thing that would happen is that this higher osmolarity, as we learned in the last session, those osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus would also be stimulated, and they would cause vasopressin to be secreted. Together, so you would be increasing your water intake, and that water intake would go through the kidneys, and your kidneys would improve water reabsorption. So you'd improve the reabsorption of water, and you'd increase the amount of fluid. That increased water intake is going to increase your extracellular volume, and that'll actually increase blood pressure. So that's a problem. You don't want to increase blood pressure too much just by ingesting salt. So there's a second response that would happen. The second response is that the increased blood pressure is going to stimulate your cardiovascular reflexes. So remember those baroreceptor reflex? that baroreceptor reflex is going to be stimulated to bring the blood pressure back down to normal. Over time, the kidneys are going to be able to excrete salt. This is a slower process, but it does happen. But overall, this homeostatic response to salt, the two major players here are you increase thirst and you increase vasopressin release. And both of those will increase, one will increase fluid conservation, but that the thirst response will increase your water intake, which means that the water that you are taking into your GI tract and absorbing will be conserved. And overall, that will help dilute some of the change in osmolarity and will bring that osmolarity back down to normal. These flowcharts are quite good. They discuss things in a very logical fashion. So they're definitely good things to know. The kidney can regulate sodium, and it regulates the sodium balance in close relationship with the blood pressure and blood volume. So the stimuli that actually set the sodium balance in the body, very closely related to blood pressure and blood volume. The main hormone that will regulate sodium balance is a hormone called aldosterone. And the type of hormone that it is a mineralocorticoid. It's secreted by the adrenal cortex, and it's specifically the region of the adrenal cortex called the zona glomerulosa. And this hormone will help with the reabsorption of sodium in the distal tubule of the kidney and the collecting ducts. I'm going to go through a little bit on the adrenal gland. It's not covered, I don't think, in the other course that you take. It actually might be in the health sci course, but in the event that it isn't, or that you're not taking the health sci course, I'm just going to go through a little bit of a primer on the adrenal gland. I'm just going to share a different screen here, so you should be able to see that. So when we talk about the adrenal gland, they're sometimes called the suprarenal gland as well. So there are the kidneys, and the adrenal gland sort of sits on top of the kidney. And so that's why it's called the adrenal gland. I always think it adds to the kidney, adds renal. And I better change that actually. Adrenal, sometimes referred to as the suprarenal gland. Because they sit on top of the kidneys, they're superior to the kidney. And so suprarenal gland. It has a triangular shaped appearance. It has this triangular shaped appearance. I would draw it in yellow because it does actually have a very golden yellow appearance, but yellow is a little bit difficult to see. So I'm still gonna just keep it in a darker color. It has a triangular shape to it. And there are two parts to the adrenal gland. There is the cortex of the adrenal gland, and I'm really exaggerating the thickness of the cortex right now. Cortex is the outer covering of the adrenal gland. This is the adrenal cortex. And the center of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla. If we were to take a part of the adrenal cortex and really look at it under the microscope, we'd actually see that there are three zones to the adrenal cortex. So we're going to take a small little segment of the adrenal cortex, maybe this little segment here, and we're going to look at it as it is under a microscope, although I'm not going to be able to draw an exact image. So, but what we're going to see is that we're going to take this piece of the adrenal gland, and this is going to be the superficial end, and this is going to be the deep end, deep. This is the deep part is, oh, deep. The deep aspect is the part that's closest to the adrenal medulla. And there are really three zones to this adrenal cortex. So together, this is all the adrenal cortex. And these three zones have different names. The first zone is called the zona glomerulosa. The second zone is called the zona fasciculata. And the third zone is called the zona reticularis. All three of these zones produce different hormones. And all of these hormones are the steroid hormones. Underneath here, I'm actually just going to draw underneath here, this is the adrenal medulla. So all of these zones make different steroid hormones. And so steroid hormones are based on the molecule cholesterol. And there are different types of steroid hormones, all based on cholesterol. Each zone makes a different type of hormone. The zona glomerulosa, actually one thing before we start, the way that you can remember the layers and superficial to deep is just remember the acronym GFR, like glomerular filtration rate. That's how I remember superficial to deep. In fact, that's the only way I remember the layers of the adrenal cortex. It spells the word GF, or it spells the acronym GFR. So the zona glomerulosa, this produces a hormone type called a mineralocorticoid. It's very much involved in regulation of sodium balance in the body. And this is the one that we're going to talk about. And the example of the mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. The zona fasciculata makes a different type of hormone. It makes a hormone called a glucocorticoid. And this is very much involved in the stress response. Not so much the fight or flight response. There is some that is released during fight or flight, but this is more for overall stresses in the body. It is a stress hormone. And it's involved in when you have an inflammatory state in the body or a state of any kind of trauma in the body, this stress hormone will be released in higher quantities. The best example of the glucocorticoid that is released in the body is cortisol. The zona reticularis makes a different type of steroid hormone. It makes a hormone that are called, it makes the androgen hormones. These are for secondary sexual characteristics. So some examples of these, which you probably already know, are things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. If you go down into the medulla of the kidney, adrenal medulla, the adrenal medulla secretes a hormone type called a catecholamine. And catecholamines are very important in the fight or flight response. And the two examples that you're probably all aware of are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those are all the hormones, or the main hormones that are made by the adrenal gland as a whole, both the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. So we're only going to focus on the one type of hormone that is produced by the adrenal cortex. So we're only going to focus on cortisol, or not cortisol, aldosterone. So the aldosterone now, is a mineralocorticoid. It's secreted by the adrenal cortex, and specifically that first part of the adrenal cortex, the zona glomerulosa. And so this is very important in the reabsorption of sodium in the distal tubules and collecting ducts. A lot of times what you're going to see in the body is that when there is, when sodium goes in one direction, potassium often goes in the opposite direction. Not always, but often. This is an extremely important point. It has a lot of clinical significance. So just keep it in mind as you absorb or reabsorb sodium, you secrete potassium. And so this is extremely important. Just keep it in the back of your mind. Aldosterone acts on the P cells of the distal nephron. The P cells stand for principal cells, and they help upregulate proteins that will help with sodium reabsorption. And this is the way that aldosterone works at the level of the cell. So aldosterone is released by the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex. It goes into the bloodstream, and then aldosterone enters the cell. Because it's a steroid hormones can diffuse right through the cell. They don't have any problem. But once they diffuse through the cell, they're in a liquid environment, they're in an aqueous environment, and they need to combine with a cytoplasmic receptor. This is extremely important that they combine with the cytoplasmic receptor, because when it combines with the cytoplasmic receptor, it can actually enter the cell or enter the nucleus of the cell, and this hormone receptor complex will bind to the DNA, and it will act as a factor that will increase transcription of a gene within, or several genes within the DNA. The genes that they are allowing for transcription of are those that will code for the protein synthesis for new protein channels and protein pumps that will allow for sodium to be reabsorbed. So you get your transcription happening where you're making your mRNA transcript, and then that mRNA will leave the nucleus of the cell, it'll enter the cytosol, and it will be translated into proteins that will make these new protein channels and protein pumps. And so you can see that these new channel proteins and protein pumps are going to be placed on the luminal side of the cell, or the apical surface of the cell, and will allow for increased reabsorption of sodium. So there are some sodium channels, there are some potassium channels, there are sodium potassium pumps that are created and placed into the cell membrane. And so this will allow for sodium to leave the filtrate, enter the cell, and then be pumped out and reabsorbed into the blood. Potassium, on the other hand, will go the opposite way. It will be secreted into the filtrate and you will lose potassium. Again, keep this in mind. This is an extremely important point, that you're going to get reabsorption of sodium and secretion of potassium when aldosterone is active. Sodium and water, while they're closely related, they are separately regulated. Water doesn't automatically follow sodium. You have to have vasopressin released. So just because you're reabsorbing sodium doesn't mean water is going to necessarily follow. There are no water channels that are made by aldosterone. So you need vasopressin released. And there are two primary stimuli for the release of aldosterone. One is that there is a high extracellular potassium concentration. And so when you have a high extracellular potassium concentration, sometimes referred to as hyperkalemia, and this hyperkalemia will often indicate, remember how I said that if you reabsorb sodium, you're going to lose potassium, and vice versa. The sodium and potassium tend to go in opposite directions. Well, when you have high potassium, you often have low sodium. Again, not always true, but often. And so this is why this is a primary stimulus for the release of aldosterone. Also, aldosterone is going to be released in response to low blood pressure or activation of this pathway called the RAS pathway that we will talk about. It's mainly inhibited by an increased extracellular fluid osmolarity. The higher the osmolarity of the extracellular fluid, the less sodium you need to reabsorb. And so this makes sense. There is a flow chart that will talk about the reabsorption of sodium and the stimuli. The first stimuli is that high potassium level. That high potassium level will be sensed by the adrenal cortex, and the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex will release aldosterone. That will act on the distal nephron, mostly the collecting duct cells, but also the distal convoluted tubule, and will allow for sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. Low blood pressure will activate this pathway called the RAS pathway. It will stimulate the adrenal cortex and will have the same effect. Aldosterone acts on the distal nephron and will cause or allow for sodium reabsorption and secretion. The one main inhibitory factor of aldosterone action is a high extracellular fluid osmolarity. That will inhibit the adrenal cortex from releasing aldosterone. And therefore, you won't get the action on the P cells and you won't get that reabsorption of sodium or potassium. So if someone has a very high plasma osmolarity, aldosterone is going to be inhibited. I made mention of the renin-angiotensin system. It's sometimes referred to as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And this series of enzyme reactions begins at those juxtaglomerular cells that we talked about earlier on in the renal section, so those granular cells, and they are in response to low blood pressure. So this RAS pathway is mainly used to control blood pressure, blood volume. It's extremely important in doing that. So one of the big things that will stimulate this pathway is low blood pressure. And low blood pressure will result in a lower GFR. And we know that. A low blood pressure means that there's less blood going into the glomerulus. And with less blood going into the glomerulus, there is a decreased hydrostatic pressure in the glomerulus. So you decrease glomerular filtration. What that does is it actually reduces the sodium chloride transport that is occurring across the macula densa of the distal tubule. When that is sensed, there are paracrine factors that are released, and the granular cells of the afferent arteriole, you may have to go through the anatomy of the juxtaglomerular apparatus a little bit before going through this, so that you remember where everything is. But those granular cells are going to produce an enzyme called renin. And that renin is going to be released into the blood. So this is an endocrine hormone. This is one of the endocrine hormones that the kidney produces. So renin is released into the bloodstream. And as it goes through the bloodstream, renin acts as an enzyme that will activate another enzyme in the blood. There's this other enzyme called angiotensinogen that is secreted in the plasma. This angiotensinogen comes from the liver. And as you can see, ogen, it means that it is an inactive enzyme. And it circulates in the plasma in inactive form. So it circulates in inactive form, and it will be activated by renin. So when renin is released, this angiotensinogen will be cleaved, and it'll be activated, and it will make this enzyme called angiotensin 1. So now there's this active enzyme that is circulating through the plasma. And as it circulates through the plasma, there is another enzyme called ACE. And ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. And that will actually take angiotensin 1 and produce angiotensin 2. And this is the major player of the RAS pathway. Angiotensin 2. That's the first way that you can actually get to angiotensin 2. There are a couple of other ways to get to angiotensin 2, and we're going to talk about the effects of angiotensin 2. There's a lot of them. The second way is that low blood pressure actually has a direct effect on the granular cells of the afferent arteriole, and they directly allow for the production of renin, which the latter half of this pathway is identical. The third way that you can have renin released is through the low blood pressure being sensed by the cardiovascular control center, so those baroreceptors. You'll have increased sympathetic nervous system activity, and increased sympathetic activity will cause the granular cells to also release renin. So there's really three ways that renin is released, all stemming from low blood pressure. And all of the effects of renin being released is to eventually make angiotensin 2. So there are a lot of effects of angiotensin 2. An interesting fact is that the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 by ACE was originally thought to take place in the lungs only. The lungs do make angiotensin converting enzyme, but it now is known that the endothelial cells of the blood vessels also make ACE, and the conversion takes place there as well. And here is what angiotensin 2 does. So you need to remember that the stimulus for the release of angiotensin 2 was low blood pressure, or for the production of angiotensin 2 was low blood pressure. So everything that angiotensin 2 is going to do will be in response to try to increase blood pressure or increase blood volume to therefore increase blood pressure. So the main effects of angiotensin 2, the first one is angiotensin. Angio meaning blood vessel, tensin meaning to tense up. It is a very, very potent vasoconstrictor. It's one of the most potent vasoconstrictors known. It's angiotensin 2. So the first effect is a direct effect on the arterioles. The arterioles will vasoconstrict, and that will increase total peripheral resistance, and that will increase blood pressure. So that's the first effect. The second effect is angiotensin 2 will have a direct effect on the cardiovascular control center in the medulla oblongata. And within the medulla, you will have that increased cardiovascular response. So similar to the baroreceptor response, where you're going to get an upregulation of your sympathetic nervous system and a downregulation of your parasympathetic nervous system, all to increase cardiac output, to increase peripheral resistance, to increase blood pressure. The third effect of angiotensin 2 is at the level of the hypothalamus. Angiotensin 2 will stimulate the hypothalamus to release vasopressin. And as we know, vasopressin is going to conserve blood volume. It's going to reabsorb water in the kidney to make sure that we maintain our blood volume. Angiotensin 2 will also stimulate thirst receptors. So the thirst receptors are going to be stimulated in the hypothalamus, and that is going to increase our thirst, to increase water ingestion. That water will be absorbed in the GI tract. And together with that vasopressin, you're going to conserve all that blood volume. That increased blood volume is going to increase the blood pressure. The angiotensin 2 will also affect the adrenal cortex, specifically the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex, and it will cause aldosterone to be released. That aldosterone is going to increase sodium reabsorption. And that sodium reabsorption is going to increase the amount of solute in the blood, because we've now changed the volume, because we're drinking water, and we've now diluted our volume. But that sodium reabsorption is going to make sure that we can maintain an adequate plasma osmolarity. Angiotensin 2 will have a direct effect on the proximal tubule cells as well, which will have a direct effect on sodium reabsorption as well. So a lot of effects, but every single effect is either to increase blood volume or maintain osmolarity, or increase blood pressure, because the main stimulus that caused for angiotensin 2 release was that decreased blood pressure. So it was all about bringing blood pressure back to normal. Sodium, just to note, sodium doesn't automatically raise low blood pressure, but sodium reabsorption will stimulate thirst, and that will help with increasing extracellular fluid volume and increasing blood pressure. So there's a lot of players here. There are a lot of players. The RAS pathway is one that you might have to go through a couple of times really to get your head wrapped around it. When we talk about high blood pressure, we use the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system to treat it. We use the physiology because some of the drugs that we use to treat high blood pressure act directly on this pathway. So there are several targets of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. And so if we look at, I should actually spell this right, angiotensin 1 and 2, that's okay. So here are some of the treatments for high blood pressure, because we know that this activation of angiotensin 2 is going to bring up the blood pressure. And so if we can somehow block the production of angiotensin 2 or block the effect of angiotensin 2, then we can hopefully improve someone's blood pressure if it is extremely high. If we stop angiotensin 2 from working or being produced, then maybe that blood pressure will come down, and that is the case. And so here's the major pathway of, so there's angiotensinogen that's cleaved by renin to make angiotensin 1, and angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme. That angiotensin 2 will bind to various receptors in the body. One of the receptors that it binds to is on the adrenal gland, and that adrenal gland will produce aldosterone. So at every single step of the way, we can use a medication that can block what's being produced or block what's helping activate this pathway. So at the very beginning, angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, if we can just stop the conversion of angiotensinogen, then that may have an effect on reducing the production of angiotensin 2, which would have an effect on reducing blood pressure. So there are medications called renin inhibitors. It blocks the action of renin. And one of the names of a renin inhibitor is called Razalez. Not as commonly used as the other ones. It is used, but not as common. There are medications called ACE inhibitors. These are very widely used for a number of reasons, not only high blood pressure, but other reasons as well. And ACE inhibitors, as its name implies, it blocks the action of the angiotensin converting enzyme. You can always tell an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor or an ACE inhibitor by the ending. If someone's on a medication that ends with the suffix pril, that's an ACE inhibitor. So ramipril, captopril, enalapril, all of those medications are angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. One of the major side effects of ACE inhibitors that can be a relatively intrusive annoyance in someone's life is that it can actually cause a chronic dry cough. And so if somebody develops a chronic dry cough after starting an ACE inhibitor, usually it's related to the ACE inhibitor and they'll be changed to a different medication because it can be quite intrusive. There are some really serious side effects from ACE inhibitors that are rare, but they do occur. I'm not going to get into them, but there are some serious side effects. The other place where you can actually block the action of angiotensin 2 is at the receptor level. So you can actually block angiotensin 2 at where it binds to its receptor. And this is called an AT1 receptor blocker. And you can always tell these types of medications. They're sometimes called ARBs, A-R-B. You can always tell this type of medication by the ending with sartan, olmesartan. That's any of them end in sartan. I'll never forget the time when one of the pharmaceutical sales reps came in and gave some samples of an angiotensin 2 receptor blocker or an ARB. I was a trainee at the time in medical school, and I was looking at the mechanism of action of the medication, and I saw AT1 receptor blocker, and I said, "Oh, that's odd. Why are we doing an angiotensin 1 receptor blocker?" And he said, it's not, it's an angiotensin 2 receptor blocker. And I said, well, why does it say AT1? And anyways, it turns out that there are several types of angiotensin 2 receptors. And it just so happens that there is an angiotensin 2 type 1 receptor. And that is the one that is blocking. It's the angiotensin 2 type 1. So the little subscript 1 stands for the type of angiotensin 2 receptor. So it's a little bit confusing. So this is angiotensin 2 type 1. You can also block some of the downflow of the effects of angiotensin 2. And so there are aldosterone receptor blockers as well. And this is spironolactone. The I should actually come before the R, spironolactone. And this is called an aldosterone receptor blocker. It's not called an ARB, even though it has the same acronym. This one is not called an ARB. It's an aldosterone receptor blocker. And interestingly enough, aldosterone receptor blockers, while it can be used to treat high blood pressure, it's not often used to treat high blood pressure. Um, and one of the reasons for that is because with aldosterone receptor blockers, you end up um, not having the same aldosterone effects. And so if you think about what aldosterone does, it reabsorbs sodium and secretes potassium. In the case of an aldosterone receptor blocker, you're not going to reabsorb the sodium and you're going to hold on to more potassium. So you end up keeping more potassium. And this is actually quite dangerous. Most of your potassium should be inside of your cells. That's where it should be. It should not be in the bloodstream. It should not be on the outside of the cells. It needs to be on the inside of the cells. But using this type of medication can cause the potassium levels to rise. Potassium needs to be kept within an extremely narrow range. The range of potassium, so just to give you an idea, the range for sodium is somewhere in the realm of 130 or 140 milli equivalents or milliosmoles. The range for it is 135 to 145. There's a space of, you can go up or down by 5 on either direction of of the normal value of 140 and still be in the normal range for sodium. For potassium, it is kept within such a narrow range that a normal potassium is between 3.5 milliosmoles and 5 milliosmoles. There's very little wiggle room. And keeping more potassium can be really bad. Potassium is extremely important for repolarization of neurons and for excitable cells. If you have too much potassium, your excitable cells can become so hyperpolarized that your depolarizing events can stop. And this is extremely true in all excitable cells, but especially in the heart. And you can end up with arrhythmias or even reduced heart electrical function. So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. So if you look at your normal ECG, P wave, QRS segment or complex, T wave. P wave, QRS complex, T wave. Well, when you have a high potassium, even a modestly high potassium, so a normal is up to 5, this normal being 5, even at around 5.5 milli equivalent, so sort of milliosmoles per liter, a similar sort of thing. Notice what happens to the repolarization event in the ventricle. Look how high that T wave is. It's looks even higher than the QRS complex. There's such a huge repolarization because of the high potassium. And so we call these peaked T waves. And so we sometimes will see peaked T waves in someone who has a high potassium. If you even have a higher potassium, you'll actually notice here that compared to the image above, the depolarization event is now taking longer. So your QRS complex, you still have your peak T wave, but your QRS complex is now widening. It's taking longer for depolarization to happen because it's harder for depolarization to happen. If you even go up further, you notice that the QRS complex spaces out even more, and it almost becomes one with the repolarization event. Because depolarization is now extremely hard to have occur. And this almost kind of looks like a sine wave. When I think of potassium levels in the body, I sort of think of the ECG like a string, and I sort of pull up on the T wave with as potassium levels grow higher, and I pull the string tighter and tighter and tighter. And as I pull the string tighter, the QRS complex widens out, turns into a sine wave, and eventually, if high potassium levels aren't treated, all your waveforms just disappear. And this is a very bad rhythm to have. This is called asystole, and this is no heart rhythm at all. This is no heartbeat. your cardiac output is zero. So a person uh, with, without prompt treatment of a high potassium can die. And so it's very important to recognize when a person is on medications that can disrupt their potassium balance. And so the aldosterone receptor blockers are one of those examples of medications that can do that. So we always want to make sure that we monitor people's potassium levels if they're on those types of medications. There are things that we can do to bring down the potassium at all of these stages. It's easiest to do it when the potassium is only mildly elevated. We can help bind on to potassium in the GI tract so that it doesn't get reabsorbed. We can help push the potassium back into cells. There are a lot of tricks that we can use, but it's easiest to do it when it's early on. But this is one of the reasons why potassium is dangerous if it's in too high of quantities in the blood.